Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture of the NPTEL MOOCs course on economic growth and development. I have titled today's lecture as Growth versus Development, Some Indices of Economic Development. In today's lecture, I will introduce you to some of the basic concerns as to why growth is preferable to development or development is preferable to growth, and how there have been various concerted efforts towards bringing together various indices to this literature on growth and development. As in the case of the previous classes, let us begin with a recapitulation of the last class. In the last class was planned as a general lecture and it was titled as The Global North and the Global South, Why the Divide. In the last class, I tried to bring in some of the basic concerns with regard to globalization and how globalization is at the center of the discourse on the political divide between the global north and the global south. We looked at what are the Bretton Woods paradigm prescription or the World Bank prescription with respect to globalization, and how there are certain intrinsic assumptions with respect to the global south which makes it possible for the World Bank's prescription to work out for the global north. We also looked at some of the discontents with respect to globalization and how there has been a backlash against globalization across the world. We then concluded with the reorientation of discussion with respect to international poverty or world poverty, how the global north, global south divide has been coming down over the period of last 2 decades or so, and how there are two overwhelming concerns or worldviews with respect to world poverty, the World Bank paradigm or the Bretton Woods paradigm and the UN paradigm. In today's lecture, I will first introduce you to a very important document of the human development called the Human Development Report of 1990. The United Nations Development Programme for the first time brought a document which particularly spoke about the dangers of unwarranted economic growth, and it also brought about some of the research pertaining to human development achievement levels across countries globally. Let me introduce you to this report first, which focused on human development and not just growth. And it is also important to note here that the 1990 Human Development Report of the UNDP came in at a very significant juncture of the world economy. It came at a time when the World Bank and the Bretton Woods institution comprising the IMF along with the World Bank had started prescribing structural adjustment policies and programs for various countries across Africa, Asia and Latin America. Latin American countries were reeling under a debt crisis. There was a clear disconnection with respect to economic growth and human development achievements in many countries across the world, and therefore the 1990 HDR deserves special mention, and it is befitting that I introduce you to the summary findings of this HDR report at this point of time. Now let us look at what I have tried to put together here is some of the summary findings. There are 15 significant points that this report is trying to make, and I have put them all together. I will enter into a short discussion with regard to these points so as to set the tune for a discussion of the economic indices that we need to know about. Now, this report talks about the record of human development over the period of 1960s to 1980s. So, it covers a period of 3 decades across the world, and this report had initially taken 14 countries which it had analyzed in the 1990 HDR. However, in the subsequent years and the subsequent HDRs, various other countries have been taken. Almost every country of the world today is ranked based upon the HDI or the Human Development Index. One of the first summary findings of this report was that developing countries have made significant progress towards human development in the last 3 decades. Now, let me at this point also inform you how the term human development has been understood or defined in the Human Development Report. Taking from Amartya Sen's analysis of capabilities approach, human development has mostly been defined as an expansion of choices of people, and it is considered to be more than GNP growth, more than income and wealth, and more than producing commodities and accumulating capital. So a person's access to income may be one of the choices, but it is not the sum total of all choices that an individual makes in her life or his life. Therefore, human development is considered to be a more progressive concept than GDP or GDP per capita. Now, the elaborate discussions on Human Development Index and the Human Development literature has anyway been planned in this course in the later part. So, which is why I will not go into the details of the human development concept in this lecture. The motivation of this lecture is simply to introduce you to the basic concerns about growth versus development. So, this is the first summary finding of the HDR report, which says that the developing countries have made significant progress towards human development in the last 30 years or 3 decades. It basically says that several policy conclusions from this. It talks about some of the important indicators such as life expectancy and infant mortality rates. Now, let me also give you a working definition of what is life expectancy and infant mortality rates. Life expectancy is basically the average number of years a newborn is expected to live if mortality patterns at the time of birth remains constant over a given period of time. And infant mortality rates refer to the infants or the young children who die, typically those under 1 year per 1000 live births. Now, what was this summary finding trying to tell us was that the life expectancy in South, the global South, had risen from about 46 years in 1960 to 62 years in 1987. Adult literacy rate had increased from about 43% to 60%. The under 5 mortality rate had come down drastically. Primary health care was extended to 61% of the population, and safe drinking water was provided to about 55% of the population. And despite an addition of about 2 billion people in developing countries, the rise in food production had exceeded the rise in population by about 20%. So, which means that despite the lowness of levels of income in the developing countries, the developing countries had made significant progress in terms of human development. And in many countries, however, the report also very cautiously pointed out that in many countries of Africa and Latin America, the 1980s had witnessed stagnation or even reversal in human achievements. The second important point that this report was making was with respect to the north-south gaps in basic human development, and it said that the north-south gaps in basic human development had narrowed considerably in the last 3 decades, even while income gaps had widened. Now, in 1987, the average per capita income in the south was about 6% of that in the north, but its average life expectancy was about 80% of the northern average, and its average literacy rate was about 66%. So, developing countries had reduced their average infant mortality from about nearly 200 deaths per 1000 live births to about 80 in the decades between 1950 and 1988. So, the message here was very clear that the task of taking the developing world to an acceptable threshold of human development can be accomplished. So, while the north-south gaps have narrowed in but the report also pointed out that the north-south gap in terms of human development achievements have narrowed down, but they continue to widen in advanced knowledge and high technology, which is why there was a lot of focus on technology transfer between the developed countries and the developing countries, which is something that I had focused on in the last lecture as well. The third important point was with respect to the following, that the average of progress in human development still conceals large disparities. While we are talking about the progresses made in human development in terms of life expectancy or infant mortality or safe drinking water and so on, there are various other inequalities that still get concealed in the human development index as well. While the income, the GDP estimate does not take into account various inequalities, the human development index also does not bring out various inequalities, such as that between the urban and rural areas, between men and women, between rich and poor. So the rural areas in developing countries, while they have declined, while they have brought about an increase in the achievement of human development levels, there continues to be a large rural-urban disparity as far as the achievement of human development levels is concerned. Literacy rates for women are still only about 2/3 for those of women, and this also shows that women in the third world or the global south continue to be some of the most deprived communities. Similarly, high income groups often preempt many of the benefits of social services. Levels of health, education and nutrition among higher income groups far exceed those of the poor in the many countries. So therefore, the inherent inequalities within the developing countries did not come out or has not come down, even if large progresses have been made in human development across the country, across the developing world. The fourth point was with respect to, and this was an important point that the Human Development Report was making, that fairly respectable levels of human development were possible even at fairly modest levels of income. There were various claims being made between the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s when the growth models were at its peak, that it is not possible to invest in human development issues because incomes of these countries are anyway very less, and they should focus more on investment in foreign exchange, investment in exports of primary goods and services rather than on human development achievements. And the HDR 1990 took the example of Sri Lanka, and it showed that Sri Lanka managed, while in 1990 the average world income was about $11,000 this was a per capita income of the industrial world. Sri Lanka had a per capita income of about $400, but in spite of this, Sri Lanka managed a very high life expectancy of about 71 years, which was comparable to the industrialized countries, and it had an adult literacy rate of about 87%, which was also comparable with the industrialized countries. On the contrary, Brazil had a life expectancy of only 65 years, and its adult literacy was about 78%. Whereas its per capita income in USD was about $2,020. Similarly, Saudi Arabia had a per capita income of about $6,200. Its life expectancy was 64 years, and the adult literacy rate was estimated to be about 55%. So what matters is how economic growth is managed and distributed to its for the benefit of the people in a country. So this HDR summary finding clearly dispelled the myth that it is only at very high levels of income investments will be possible in human development achievements. The fifth important point that it made was with regard to the link between economic growth and human progress, and it clearly stated that this is not an automatic link. It showed that if distribution of income is unequal and if social expenditures are very low, human development will not take place. So even if there is very high levels of income in a country, it is important to look at how this income is distributed across the population in the country. This was an important finding. Again, there was examples taken of Sri Lanka, also of Botswana and Malaysia, which during the period of structural adjustment had ensured that some of the incomes are equally distributed with respect to social services in these countries. And the HDR also noted that these countries had made impressive achievements in human development because they had well structured social policies and expenditures. Now, distributive policies which means that this finding was focusing on the idea of distributive policies, how the social sector expenditure policies are carefully planned out such that they reach all sections of the population, and properly planned distributive policies can go a long way in compensating for the effects of low GNP growth of the developing countries. The number 6 point was with respect to social subsidies of the poorer income groups, and this is again a significant point. As I have already pointed out that the 1990 HDR came on the wake of when the structural adjustment program, conditional loans prescription of the World Bank and the IMF was at its peak. It was talking about bringing down of social subsidies, social sector expenditures in health, in education, in food, in agriculture, in industry and so on and so forth. That was a time when the HDR 1990 comes in and says that social subsidies are absolutely necessary for poorer income groups, and particularly for the third world where there is uneven income, where incomes are not distributed properly. And this was also for the first time literature in this area thickened, which said that growth simply does not trickle down. So the trickle down effect does not take place. Free market mechanisms may be vital for allocative efficiency, but they do not ensure distributive justice. The number 7 point was about developing countries are not too poor to pay for human development, and they can take care of economic growth. There was this view that human development can be promoted only at the expense of economic growth, and HDR noted that this poses a false trade-off, and it misstates the purpose of development and underestimates the returns on investment in health and education. In fact, certain calculations were carried out which showed that with a 1% investment made in education and health, what would be the returns to private investment, which means that if the enrollment say of children in schools are increasing, or if somebody is completing primary education, what will be its effect on the overall investment in the economy. For Africa, it was shown that private returns to primary education was as high as 43%, in Asia it was as high as 31%, and in Latin America it was as high as 32%. So social returns, private returns meaning increase in investments, because you have a more skilled population, you have a more technical workforce within the economy, it leads to more of private returns to investment. Social returns from female literacy were also shown to be much higher in terms of reduced fertility, reduced infant mortality, lower school dropout rates, and improved family nutrition and lower population growth, which basically means that if you're investing more and more on the females, on the education of females, if you're spending more on the health of girls and women and so on and so forth, then it leads to lower school dropouts, it leads to higher productivity of the labor force, and so on and so forth. The 8th point that this report made was with respect to the human costs of adjustment are often a matter of choice and not of compulsion. And this is also again significant in the wake of the World Bank prescriptions, which says that countries needed to adjust because of the fiscal imbalances that have taken place. The countries need to adjust. However, the report pointed out that adjustment is a matter of choice and not compulsion. While taking care of fiscal prudence within an economy, the countries across the world can decide, particularly the developing countries of the third world can decide where their money should go to, whether they should sustain their expenses on the social sector such as health, education, food, and so on. And many countries and also during this period, while many countries across the third world or the global south went on to reduce social sector expenditures, their military spending had risen, and the HDR 1990 was posing an ethical question of whether it is whether it is all right to increase spending on military on the head of defense and military purposes, and reduce social sector spending on education and health and food and so on. The 9th point was regarding a favorable external environment, which is vital to support human development strategies in the 1990s. This point was made because comparable estimates showed that the net transfers, foreign exchange transfers from the developed world to the developing countries had come down drastically during the period of the 1980s. And the estimates actually show that the net transfer of resources to the developing countries had reversed from a positive flow of $42.6 billion in 1981 to a negative flow of $32.5 billion in 1988. Primary commodity prices had reached their lowest level since the Great Depression of the 1930s, and foreign debts of developing countries more than $1.3 trillion, and it required nearly about $200 billion a year in debt servicing alone. And this was the figures that was provided by the 1990 HDR. The figures will be revised must have been revised in the recent years. However, the important point to note here is that a large amount of reserves went into debt servicing, which means you are paying an interest rate on the conditional loans provided by the international financial institutions, on the conditions of opening up your markets, opening up the markets of the developing countries. So the HDR pointed out in the 1990s it is imperative that the rich countries start transferring resources to the developing countries. The number 10 point was that it focused its attention on Africa, particularly the sub-Saharan African countries, and it showed that Africa continues to suffer greatest human deprivation, particularly those in the south of the Sahara. And Africa has the lowest life expectancy of all developing regions, highest infant mortality rates, and the lowest literacy rates. Its average per capita income also fell in the 1980s. So there was a growing trend of concentration of poverty in Africa, and all concerted international efforts should focus on Africa, was the message provided by the Human Development Report of 1990. The number 11 point that the HDR made was with respect to technical cooperation, which must be restructured if it is to help build human capabilities and national capacities in the developing countries. It was found that the amount of technical assistance provided by the developed countries to the developing countries mostly comprised of spending on their technical expertise. And some of the estimates are show that technical assistance to Africa amounted to about $4 billion a year, which was about $7 a person, which means that this much amount was being spent on the technical experts being sent from the developed world to the developing countries, and this must stop. This amount of spending on technical, so which means that nation building exercises must take place within the developing countries, and local experts must be built. There must be a training of national personnel such that such kind of expenses on technical expertise in the developed world must come down. It was also stressed that the involvement of NGOs is crucial to any strategy of successful human development. The role of the state was redefined in this HDR, and it underlined the importance of the NGO movement, the non-government organization movement, and also of the self-help groups. And it clearly said that the NGOs are generally small, flexible and cost effective, and most of them aim at building self-reliant development. They understand the local needs well, and therefore it is important that NGOs become a part of the state machinery, where they work together with the state, and therefore there was a tendency toward there was an effort towards towards redefining the role of the state by including the role of NGOs and other organizations. The next point was with regard to significant reduction in population growth rates. Now, if we look at the period between the 1950s and the 1980s, although the population growth rate had declined, the levels of population were still very high in developing countries, and therefore the HDR suggested appropriate mechanisms to contain population growth rates in the developing countries. The next was with regard to rapid population growth in the developing world becoming concentrated in the cities, and this is something which I had discussed in the last class as well, that while and this was also a fallout of the rapid globalization and privatization policies that were followed in the developing countries, that while a massive retrenchment of workers from the agricultural sector took place from the rural areas, and they have nowhere to move to other than the cities or the urban areas, but the cities have not come up with enough industries to be able to absorb the massive incoming of these workers from the rural areas. So there's a lot of concentration in the cities without proper infrastructural arrangements, without proper health facilities, without proper education facilities, and without any employment, and that is a major concern. The last point that the HDR 1990 was making was with respect to sustainable development strategies, and this is mostly about not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and there is of course a growing consensus on this, but the HDR underlined the importance of broadening the concept of sustainable development by not just including protection of natural resources and physical environment, but also including the protection of future economic growth and future human development. If I have to give you a sense of very briefly a sense of what we are arriving at here by looking at the summary findings of the HDR. This is to say that there has been a lot of discussion with regard to growth versus development, that growth of national income is not all, growth of GDP per capita incomes is not all. One needs to look at the overall human development of a country to be able to come up with a conclusion with regard to how far we have progressed. Now, taking this discussion forward, in 2010, scholars such as George Gray, Molina and Mark Purser, they came up with a very interesting paper titled Human Development Trends in 1970, a social convergence story. And what they were trying to do here is very interesting in this paper. They took a unique set of data of the Human Development Index of 111 countries to describe how they have progressed between the period of 1970 to 2005. And they were trying to examine a simple question, that do HDI and income measure the same thing? There were certain general conclusions from this paper which I will first point out, and then I will come to this figure. I will explain this figure in some time here. But some of the general conclusions that Molina and Mark Purser were emphasizing on were as follows. They found that 110 of the 111 countries had showed considerable progress in their HDI levels over this period of 1970 to 2005, over this 35-year period, which means that it is not that no progress took place in the developing countries. They had considerably progressed in education, in health, in drinking water facilities, in basic needs, basic facilities and so on and so forth. The second point that they were trying to make was that HDI growth was fastest for low HDI and middle HDI countries in the pre-1990 period, which means that post 1990 the growth of human development levels have declined in the low HDI and middle HDI countries, but in the pre-1990 period, because of various programs and policies followed by the governments, the human development levels had increased at a rapid rate in the so-called low HDI and middle HDI countries. They also said that life expectancy and education components grew much faster than income in these countries, and most importantly they found that income and non-income components of HDI change have a near zero correlation. There is no correlation between income and non-income components. So as I said, they were trying to examine a very straightforward question, that do HDI and income measure the same thing? And there are many detractors of the human development concept and as well as of the human development index, as there are detractors of various indices and concepts. They claim that HDI, or the human development index, basically follows income, which means that HDI and income have a positive correlation. If income rises, HDI rises. If income goes down, HDI comes down. So they say that HDI is an unnecessary addition to this literature and GDP per capita is enough. Now there is a lot of literature trying to dispel this claim. The 1996 Human Development Report is notable among them. However, such detractors continue to exist. But let us look at Molina and Purser's Purser's examination of GDP and HDI levels in this 2010 paper that they carried out. They try to refute this claim that HDI and income are interchangeable, and instead they find that the non-income components of HDI provide valuable insights into understanding how human development has changed over time. If you look at this graph, it has two panels, the upper panel and the lower panel. You need to read this graph from left to right. Let us say in the upper panel, the left graph, let us say it is graph A, the panel A, panel B, then panel C and panel D. In panel A, you see the plots of an income index against HDI for the year 2005. In panel B shows income index against the non-income indicators of average of life expectancy and education for 2005. Panel C shows the change in income index between 1970 to 2005 and the change in human development index between 1970 to 2005. And panel D, which is the most interesting one, it shows the change in income index against the average growth of life expectancy and education indices of 1970 to 2000, between 1970 to 2005. Let me begin explaining each of these panels one by one. The first panel of this figure shows what critics often point out in demonstrating how closely HDI and income are related. So this figure shows how HDI and income index levels, how the HDI and income index levels went together or were positively correlated in 2005, and you see that there is in fact a very high degree of positive correlation, and this paper states that it was about 95%. It shows about a 95% correlation, which means that very high HDI levels also necessarily means very high income levels, and vice versa. Panel B plots the income index against the average of education and health indices and shows that this relationship begins to weaken. If you see, the scatter plots start falling apart from the trend line, from the line that has been fitted. However, there still seems to be a very high positive correlation, and this is only for 2005, and the paper states that the correlation is about 88%, but the correlation seems to have weakened from panel A to panel B. In panel C, the relationship almost breaks down, and this graph shows the absolute difference from 1970 to 2005 for HDI and the income index. The fitted line is still upward sloping. There is some kind of a positive correlation, but there is substantial variation among the 111 countries in the sample. Note here that the index on the y-axis here is that of the Human Development Index, and on the x-axis is the income index. However, the panel D shows that the positive relationship completely disappears. The line is now showing a negative relationship between change in income index and the non-income indicators of average growth of life expectancy and education. Now, one cannot of course claim that the relationship between income and non-income components is inherently negative, but the empirical exercises carried out by various scholars based upon the data from the various countries shows us that the advances in incomes need not necessarily translate itself into advances in other human development dimensions, and it is very clear from these graphs, but the aggregates obviously paint a different picture, as you see in panel A and panel B and panel C. But if you disaggregate the components in terms of individual indicators, incomes need not necessarily move in the same direction as that of, say, life expectancy and education, and this I think is an important thing to be noted here. Now let us move on to, having introduced you to this debate or concerns with respect to growth versus development, let me now come to what has been the motivation of trying to bring these ideas to you. The motivation is simply to tell you that while GDP per capita or national income accounts continue to dominate the mainstream thinking, the mainstream literature of growth and development, there have been concerted efforts and continuing efforts. There are efforts continuing that show that there are other estimates of importance. There are other indices which can be more representative of telling us the levels of development of a country. And it is also important to note here why we are emphasizing so much on indices, why we are emphasizing so much on an estimate, the GDP estimate or the HDI estimate or some other estimates that I will be discussing now. It is important because we are looking at comparability of countries here. When we are looking at growth models, when we are looking at development models, what we are interested in is to look at how one country is performing with respect to the other, how one region is performing with respect to the other, and therefore the emphasis on coming up with some kind of an index which will be comparable across countries. Now let me begin with some of the indices. One of the indices that was introduced in 1970s, it was referred to as the Physical Quality of Life Index, and this index was posed directly against the GDP estimates. It was an attempt to measure the quality of life or well-being of a country, and this value is basically an average of three basic statistics. There is basic literacy rate, infant mortality rate, and life expectancy at age 1. This index was constructed for an organization called the Overseas Development Council by a sociologist named Maurice D. Morris, He published a paper titled A Physical Quality of Life Index in the journal Urban Ecology, and he said the following about this index. One of the first things that he said was that this index was posited against the GNP or GNP measure or any other monetary measure of development, because there was a lot of dissatisfaction with respect to the GDP and the GNP estimates, as it did not show how the social benefits are distributed. Secondly, this index came up because various other standards of development such as nutrition and health were supposedly more ethnocentric in character. Now, ethnocentrism basically means that you are evaluating others' cultures based upon the standards of your own culture. For example, food, what we eat in India may be different from what people eat in Sudan, and and similarly what people eat in Sweden or in USA. But if we are comparing the standards of food or the standards of what should be the amount of food taken, what should be the variety of food taken based upon what is being consumed in, say, Sweden or USA, then of course we are committing an error here. And this is largely what ethnocentrism basically means. And there were various nutrition and health standards of measurement that went on in the 1960s and the 70s, even in the 50s. However, it suffered from this very problem of ethnocentrism, and this is why Morris comes up with a more comparable estimate of physical quality of life index. And he did say that it is basically to minimize cultural and developmental ethnocentricity and can be internationally comparable. So this measure is a relatively easy to calculate measure. There are all of these indicators: literacy rate, infant mortality rate, and life expectancy at age 1 are converted into indices, and these indices, all these indices have equal weights, and then there is a simple arithmetic mean calculation that takes place based upon all of these three indices. The scale is from 1 to 100, and based upon historical experience, the worst is 1 and the best is 100, and then it is simply arithmetic mean of equally weighted, and all the indicators are equally weighted. Now, based upon the PQLI, various experiments were carried out, various experiments in comparing levels of development across of countries were carried out. And it was shown that Sri Lanka, which had a per capita income of $150, and this was in 1970s, had a very high PQLI, or a physical quality of life index. And Morris also proposed and suggested that this index may actually lead us to less costly methods of life quality improvement as than now are used. Now, that is, when the physical quality of life index was doing the rounds of measuring quality of life in the growth and development literature, various criticisms came up. Various criticisms came up showing that this does not tell us much about human welfare. However, various experiments were carried out in actually implementing actually constructing of PQLI for countries, and policy interventions also took place based upon the PQLI. The Human Development Index, I will not go into the details of the Human Development Index as it is meant to be taken up in the later part of this course. However, just to introduce you to the basic dimensions of the Human Development Index, this of course came up in 1990, much later after the PQLI, but it draws a lot from the experiences of the PQLI. There were three major dimensions. First was to lead a long and healthy life. It was mostly talking about a health indicator. To acquire knowledge, that was an education dimension. It talked about education indicators, and to have access to resources or needed for a decent standard of living, which basically talked about an income indicator. So, health, education and income were the three important indicators that were taken up in the construction of the HDI. The HDI was a clear improvement over the PQLI, because the PQLI completely denied the importance of income in the index, and the importance was only on outcome indicators of literacy and health, whereas income was not taken as an important indicator. But the HDR of 1990 or the developments in the 1980s, 70s and 80s had clearly shown that while income is not the only indicator of economic development, it is definitely an important one. It needs to be associated with various other components of development as well. So HDI works better than PQLI as a measure of development because it represents both physical and financial attributes. It's a composite index like the PQLI. We will see that in detail in the later classes. In 2010, the Human Development Report came up with an improvement over the HDI, where they were adjusting for inequality in countries, and therefore they came up with the inequality adjusted human development index, and it is said that the IHDI measures the actual level of human development because it is accounting for inequality within the countries. So simple HDI remains useful, but IHDI gives more insights into the potential of human development across countries. This is the next 2 points are about the definitions of human development, which I believe we will keep it for the later classes. There is another concept which has been doing rounds in the last few years, and this is referred to as the Gross National Happiness Index, and this index has also the backing of the United Nations now. This was first carried out in Bhutan and has now been replicated in many other countries as well. It is variously known as the Well-being Index or the National Happiness Index, but it came into the vocabulary of growth and development literature in 1972 when the King of Bhutan said that gross national happiness is more important than gross domestic product. And the recent estimates that have been carried out for the country of Bhutan shows us that there are 9 domains which are considered for calculation of the gross national happiness index: the psychological well-being, health, education, time use, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity, and resilience in living standards. And this resilience in living standards is a proxy for incomes. And this index of GNH has been highly acclaimed because it talks about sustainable development, and it takes a holistic approach towards notions of progress and give equal importance to non-economic aspects of well-being. Various organizations have come together for providing estimates based upon the gross national happiness index. However, the major criticism with respect to the GNH is the term happiness, or the measurability of well-being of individuals within a country, because here we are talking about subjective well-being than objective well-being. As we are talking about measuring something, measuring a subjective attribute than something which is more objective in nature. We will also take up a discussion on the various elements of subjectivity and objectivity in measuring an index when we come to the Human Development Index. However, this is just to tell you that the Gross National Happiness Index has also been forwarded or advanced as an alternative to the GDP estimate. In the recent years, there have been various sustainable development indicators. If you can recall from the last class where I mentioned about the one of the important limitations of GDP being that the environmental damages are not considered as a debit. Therefore, various efforts have gone on to come up with sustainable development indicators, the notable amongst them being Environmental Sustainability Index, we have ecological footprints, carbon dioxide ecological footprints, dashboard of sustainability, green GDP, index of sustainable economic welfare, sustainable net benefit index, and so on and so forth. It is impossible to get into the details of each of these indices in these classes. However, I would like to focus on one, the green GDP. The green GDP started, the talks about green GDP started in the 1970s by economists such as Nordos and Tobin, and many other estimates related to green GDP have been carried out in the past, such as the measure of economic welfare, which adjusts GDP to include the value of leisure time, unpaid work, and environmental damages. They also define a sustainable measure of economic welfare value, and their work is considered to be a precursor to more sophisticated measure of sustainable development, and it is also considered to be a precursor to the estimate of green GDP. Now, efforts to account for environment in the system of national accounts has been on, as you can see, since the 1970s, and various policy documents have emerged since then. However, very few reports on green GDP are available in the public domain, And one of the first green GDP accounting report was worked out for the year 2004 for China, and it was published in China in 2006. And that report showed that the financial losses caused by pollution was more than about $60 billion, or about 3.1% of the Chinese economy. And as an experiment in national accounting, the green GDP effort failed, and the subsequent report which was supposed to be come out in 2007 did not come out, because it became clear that when you are adjusting for environmental damages, it had reduced the growth rate to a politically unacceptable level, and that became grave danger for showing the competitiveness of the country in the global order. Therefore, the green GDP calculations were given up, and as of now we do not see much, we do not hear much about green GDP estimates in the mainstream, the so-called mainstream literature of growth and development. However, that is not to say that the efforts towards this has ceased, and it continues to, and such efforts continue to rise in today's world. Now let me summarize our discussion today. This class was devoted to introducing you to some of the basic indices of economic development, and these indices of economic development are mostly posed against the dominant GDP estimate, because the dominant income model of development. We began with a discussion of the Human Development Report of 1990 brought out by the United Nations Development Program, and I deliberated on this fact that it is important to look at the HDR 1990 report, because it came at a significant juncture where the Bretton Woods paradigm was focusing more on structural adjustment prescriptions for the global south, and fiscal imbalances were taking place in most of these countries. The global north-south political divide was being reoriented towards a discussion on international poverty or world poverty, and therefore it was important to look at how income is not the most important indicator of development. Along with income, there needs to be more components which lead towards enlargement of people's choices. We also looked at a research paper which showed the progress of human development across 111 countries between the period 1970 to 2005, which is an important era in the development discourse of the world, and it showed that non-income indicators and income indicators need not necessarily move together. At the aggregate level, when we are taking indices of income and plotting them against the indices of human development, there seems to be an overall positive relationship, but a weak positive relationship. But when we disaggregate the index in the form of just life expectancy at birth or education, then we see that income does not have even a positive relationship. The positive relationship indeed breaks down. So that provides an answer to the claim of many detractors that the HDI and GDP basically mean the same, and it also challenges the politics of income being the only criterion of development. Moving ahead, we also tried to see some of the economic indices, the development indices that are used in the literature of growth and development. There are many more indices. However, I picked and chose only a few to be discussed, because these are the most important ones that are central to the curriculum of economics when we study growth and development: the PQLI, the HDI, the GNH, and the green GDP measure. However, there are many more measures which may be taken up which are taken up by researchers when they are studying development in different contexts. We will end today's lecture with this. In the next lecture, I will bring up the concept of inclusive growth. We will discuss what inclusive growth means, where did it emerge from, what are the countries that are advancing the idea of inclusive growth, what are the components of inclusive growth, and does it also mean that it is an extension of the concept of growth, as in growth of GDP, or much more than that. See you in the next class. Thank you.